The newsroom erupted as anchors shouted breaking news, their voices trembling with urgency. Sarah Williams said, "The nation is in shock tonight, a beloved sports hero accused of unthinkable crimes." Camera flashes exploded like lightning in a storm, blinding those in the courtroom. Michael Harris said, "This isn't just a scandal, it's a tragedy unfolding before millions of eyes." The fallen star sat hunched, his hands trembling, his face pale under the harsh lights, silence crashing over him like waves. Emily Clark whispered, "People adored him, trusted him, and now he stands accused of betrayal and violence." Judges whispered to each other. The sound of the gavel cut the tension with violent finality. David Miller said, "What began as whispers of rumors has erupted into full-blown disaster." Fans outside screamed, some in rage, some in disbelief, their posters torn in half by trembling hands. Reporters leaned forward, their pens scratching like daggers cutting through his legacy. Laura Johnson said, "The truth is no longer hidden in shadows. The crimes have entered daylight." The first revelation hit. The man once seen as a champion was now exposed as the center of an unimaginable crime. The television screens across the nation replayed the scandal on a loop, each headline louder than the last. Sarah Williams said, "He was once a hero to millions, now a pariah under the world's gaze." Fallen star stared blankly, every image of him now weaponized against his legacy. Emily Clark whispered, "Children wore his jerseys, now they watch their idol destroyed in real time." Fans sobbed in living rooms, throwing posters into trash bins. Michael Harris said, "The rise was meteoric, but the fall feels bottomless." The news anchors never stopped, dissecting every detail, analyzing every look, turning silence into spectacle. David Miller said, "In this moment, history does not remember victories, only sins carved into the headlines." Crowds filled city squares as protesters clashed, chanting his name in anger and sorrow. Laura Johnson said, "What once united fans now divides them with fury." Police struggled to hold the barricades, sirens echoing. Emily Clark whispered, "I never imagined this would become more than headlines." The fallen star's face appeared on giant screens, flashing accusations in bold red letters. David Miller said, "His downfall is not contained. It spills into the streets, into homes, into every corner of the nation." The scandal had leapt beyond gossip, becoming a crisis of trust and betrayal. Inside the courthouse halls, whispers echoed as lawyers scurried past. Michael Harris said, "Every detail of this case could seal his fate." The fallen star walked slowly under heavy guard, his eyes darting toward the cameras. Sarah Williams whispered, "The silence of this hallway feels heavier than the trial itself." Fans pressed against glass doors, desperate for a glimpse, their cries muffled by walls. David Miller said, "History is etched not in victories today, but in humiliation." The tension coiled tighter with each footstep, every flash of light a dagger into his reputation. The first day of trial began with chaos, the air heavy with gasps and muffled outrage. Laura Johnson said, "This is no longer speculation. The evidence has arrived." The fallen star sat with eyes hollow, jaw clenched. Emily Clark whispered, "The silence in this room feels like suffocation." Sarah Williams said, "Cameras are merciless, documenting his downfall second by second." The gavel struck again, and the whispers fell silent. Michael Harris said, "This moment will be etched into history. The day a champion was unmasked before the world. The world remembered how the fallen star rose from nothing, his story once a beacon of hope." Sarah Williams said, "He was the boy who defied gravity, running faster than limits allowed. Cameras captured him lifting trophies, a nation cheering in unity." Michael Harris said, "He wasn't just an athlete, he was a symbol of strength." The crowds roared his name as banners filled arenas, his smile wide, his eyes bright with glory. Emily Clark whispered, "Children saw him as a superhero, larger than life." His victories were etched into history, moments of pure triumph replayed endlessly. Laura Johnson said, "Fame carried him higher than he ever imagined." Yet, in shadows, whispers of doubt began to surface, contracts signed in haste, promises made in desperation. David Miller said, "Even the brightest light casts a shadow," and his was growing. The emotional tether tightened, his rise dazzling but fragile. Beneath the spotlight of glory, cracks had begun to appear. Laura Johnson said, "The adoration blinded many to the loneliness he carried." Behind cameras, the fallen star's laughter was forced, his eyes darting nervously. Emily Clark whispered, "Fame is a crown heavy with chains." He smiled for interviews, but silence after applause was deafening. Sarah Williams said, "He clung to perfection, terrified of failure." Contracts grew, expectations mounted, and his world became a cage. Michael Harris said, "With each win, the pressure doubled." Friends faded, replaced by handlers who demanded more. David Miller said, "Every cheer echoed like a countdown to collapse." His anchor was built not only on admiration, but also the seeds of betrayal, planted quietly in moments no one saw. The cameras loved him, and brands lined up to claim his image. Sarah Williams said, "Every smile sold shoes, every gesture became gold." His face lit billboards across cities, his story marketed like a fairy tale. Michael Harris said, "But behind those lights was exhaustion." He signed autographs endlessly, his grin stretched thin. Laura Johnson whispered, "Fame devoured his freedom piece by piece." The fallen star kept running, but the pace was unsustainable. Emily Clark said, "Even heroes need rest," but he was denied it. Contracts tightened their grip, clauses binding him to appearances, interviews, endless obligations. David Miller said, "A desperate signature one night became the root of future ruin." In that moment, the foundation of betrayal was laid. Behind closed doors, temptation whispered louder than applause. Laura Johnson said, "A lover entered his life. Beautiful, mysterious, and dangerously persuasive. She wrapped him in charm, her presence intoxicating yet suffocating." Emily Clark whispered, "Love or trap," the line blurred. The fallen star clung to her, craving an anchor, but she held secrets. Sarah Williams said, "Her influence grew, steering choices in ways unseen." Michael Harris said, "Advisors warned, but he ignored them, blinded by affection." Friends faded further into shadows, replaced by manipulation. David Miller said, "This was the beginning of corruption hidden in plain sight." The emotional bond became both salvation and doom, planting betrayal deep within the heart of love. The world saw the champion smiling, but behind the lens, the cracks deepened. Sarah Williams said, "Behind every headline of triumph lay whispers of reckless choices." The fallen star grew reckless at parties, surrounded by strangers who cheered his name for profit. Emily Clark whispered, "The spotlight hides, but never protects." His charm covered his exhaustion, but his trust was misplaced. Michael Harris said, "He leaned on those who would one day betray him." Laura Johnson said, "The corruption spread like a stain, unnoticed until too late." David Miller said, "The emotional anchor has shifted, from hope to tragedy waiting to erupt." The world still adored him, but the storm was already gathering. The pressure mounted as whispers became headlines. Sarah Williams said, "Rumors of late-night fights and reckless behavior spread like wildfire." The fallen star smiled for cameras, but inside, his world cracked. Michael Harris said, "Once praised for discipline, he now stumbled through interviews." Photographers captured him leaving clubs at dawn, his charm fading into shadows. Emily Clark whispered, "Addiction gnawed at him, but he denied every accusation." Friends distanced themselves, his circle shrinking to enablers. Laura Johnson said, "Each step deeper into chaos stripped away the image of a champion." Betrayals multiplied, contracts threatened collapse, and every cheer sounded like judgment. David Miller said, "The storm was no longer distant, it raged inside his soul." His downfall accelerated with every misstep. The cracks widened in public view. Laura Johnson said, "His anger spilled onto reporters, his temper caught on camera." The fallen star shoved microphones aside, his mask slipping. Emily Clark whispered, every outburst became another weapon against him. Headlines blared his fury, sponsors pulled away, and friends vanished. Sarah Williams said, the man once adored had become unpredictable and feared. His eyes burned with exhaustion, paranoia brewing in every glance. Michael Harris said, his empire, once untouchable, began to tremble. Debt rumors swirled, the lavish lifestyle impossible to sustain. David Miller said, the pressure of secrets turned every smile into a scream. The dissent was no longer quiet. It thundered through the media. The paparazzi fed on his collapse. Sarah Williams said, images of him stumbling through streets sold faster than victories ever did. Photographers lurked at every corner, hungry for blood. Michael Harris said, he was no longer a man, but prey. Flashbulbs turned nights into battlefields, his privacy shredded. Emily Clark whispered, even his home became a cage of lenses. Friends betrayed him, selling stories to tabloids for cash. Laura Johnson said the media did not just report, they devoured. Every misstep, every shadowed glance printed as scandal. David Miller said, his name was no longer chanted with pride, but spit out with venom. His image fractured, his humanity erased by spectacle. His inner circle collapsed. Laura Johnson said, trusted allies turned into enemies, selling his secrets. The fallen star raged in private bottles scattered around him. Emily Clark whispered, I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. His closest friends grew silent, replaced by opportunists. Sarah Williams said, every warning was ignored, every plea discarded. His desperation grew, reaching for substances, drowning pain in excess. Michael Harris said, the empire cracked, each decision a blade against his own skin. David Miller said, addiction is not just consumption, it is surrender. The champion was gone, replaced by a man devoured by his own shadows. The night came that sealed his fate. Sarah Williams said, and then one call changed everything. Phones rang, police sirens echoed, chaos followed. Michael Harris said, no one knew the full story, but the damage was irreversible. The fallen star's eyes widened as authorities arrived. Emily Clark whispered, this was the moment I knew his life had shattered. His crimes, once whispered, now screamed through official reports. Laura Johnson said, the empire fell with a single headline. Fans gasped, families cried, the nation stunned into silence. David Miller said, nothing would ever be the same. This was the door slamming shut. The downfall was no longer unfolding. It had arrived with brutal finality. The mask finally shattered under investigation. Sarah Williams said, documents revealed a hidden life, secret accounts, and unreported dealings. The fallen star sat pale, his silence louder than denial. Michael Harris said, what was once rumor became undeniable fact. Investigators traced links to shady organizations, money flowing through illegal channels. Emily Clark whispered, this was darker than anyone imagined. Contracts signed in back rooms surfaced, showing betrayal cloaked in wealth. Laura Johnson said, his empire wasn't built on triumph alone, but on deception. Fans gasped as the evidence spread across networks, their hero unmasked. David Miller said, the champion was not only reckless, he was criminal. The truth no longer whispered but screamed, exposing the rot beneath the glory. Public reeled as the depth of betrayal grew clearer. Sarah Williams said, millions once invested in his brand, never knowing they funded lies. His charity, once praised, revealed as a front. Michael Harris said, donations vanished, lining pockets instead of helping children. The fallen star looked down, unable to meet cameras. Emily Clark whispered, this betrayal cut deepest of all, hope stolen from the innocent. Images of smiling children at events replayed on screens, now seen as exploitation. Laura Johnson said, the illusion collapsed in seconds. Fans cried in anger, their faith manipulated. David Miller said, heroes turned villains when truth is revealed. The twist was not scandal, but the devastation of broken trust. Whispers turned into roaring accusations. Sarah Williams said, the evidence stretched beyond finances. There was violence hidden in shadows. Reports of altercations surfaced, silenced by wealth. Michael Harris said, victims now stepped forward, no longer afraid. Court filings revealed silenced voices, faces once invisible. Emily Clark whispered, the betrayal wasn't only financial, it was personal, brutal. Paparazzi replayed clips of his outbursts now seen differently. Laura Johnson said, the hero image was a mask for chaos beneath. The nation shifted from mourning to rage, betrayal echoing in every headline. David Miller said, the twist was not only crime, it was cruelty unmasked. The nightmare was uglier than anyone feared. As truth emerged, allies vanished. Sarah Williams said, the people who once defended him now turned away. Sponsors pulled support, stadiums stripped banners overnight. Michael Harris said, every trace of his glory was erased like it never existed. Friends who clung to his fame disappeared. Emily Clark whispered, he was alone, abandoned by all who once cheered him. Even his lover's smile faded into betrayal, her hand guiding investigators. Laura Johnson said, the betrayal was complete, personal, and professional. Crowds jeered outside his mansion, demanding justice. David Miller said, he was no longer a champion but a criminal in public eyes. The world shifted, his empire reduced to ashes before his eyes. The final twist silenced the nation. Sarah Williams said, the lover who once stood beside him revealed the damning evidence. Her voice played in leaked recordings, exposing manipulation and secrets. Michael Harris said, she was never a partner, but the betrayer hidden in plain sight. The fallen star's face broke, realizing the betrayal came from closest quarters. Emily Clark whispered, he trusted her more than anyone, and she destroyed him. Laura Johnson said, the twist was not just exposure, it was betrayal carved into his soul. Fans gasped, unable to comprehend the depth of treachery. David Miller said, the mask ripped away not by strangers, but by the one he loved most. The revelation left silence heavier than screams, his downfall sealed. The courtroom became a stage where every flash burned deeper than fire. Sarah Williams said, the cameras will not blink, they will witness every second of his ruin. The fallen star sat rigid, his hands clenched, his eyes darting nervously. Michael Harris said, this trial is not only about law but about legacy burned to ash. Photographers swarmed like vultures, recording every twitch, every flinch. Emily Clark whispered, I felt the air grow heavy, like judgment had already been passed. The prosecution hammered the evidence, voices sharp as knives. Laura Johnson said, each testimony struck like a bullet, tearing away illusions. Fans filled the gallery, divided between rage and sorrow. David Miller said, empires collapse not in silence but in thunder, and this thunder shook the nation. The climax had begun, brutal and relentless. The prosecution unleashed its arsenal. Sarah Williams said, witnesses lined up, each story darker than the last. The fallen star's face twitched as voices described violence, fraud, and betrayal. Michael Harris said, this was not character assassination. It was truth exposed. Papers slammed on the desk, audio played, silence followed like thunder. Emily Clark whispered, every word felt like a blade carving into him. His lover testified coldly, eyes steady, voice calm as she sealed his destruction. Laura Johnson said, this was not justice alone. It was betrayal sharpened into weapon. Crowds outside roared, the trial broadcast to millions. David Miller said, in this room, the hero was buried, and the villain emerged. The climax burned hotter with every revelation. The defense tried desperately to salvage hope. Sarah Williams said his lawyers painted him as a man broken by fame. The fallen star lowered his head, eyes brimming but dry. Michael Harris said, the jury listened, but their faces hardened. Photographs of triumph were displayed, banners of his past victories shone. Emily Clark whispered, The memories of glory could not erase the evidence of ruin. His voice cracked as he spoke, pleading for understanding, but silence swallowed the words. Laura Johnson said, he was no longer a champion pleading innocence, but a man begging for mercy. The jury's stares pierced deeper than any headline. David Miller said, mercy does not return to those who built empires on lies. The climax reached unbearable intensity. Silence louder than cries. The betrayal struck hardest when his closest ally spoke. Sarah Williams said, the man who once called him brother now condemned him. A former teammate described nights of chaos and silence bought with money. Michael Harris said, this testimony shattered the last thread of loyalty. The fallen star shook his head in disbelief, his lips trembling. Emily Clark whispered, this was not just betrayal. It was annihilation. The teammate's voice cracked but continued, revealing secrets hidden for years. Laura Johnson said, the final dagger came not from enemies but from friends. Gasps filled the gallery, silence crushing every word. David Miller said, when loyalty dies, the empire collapses completely. The climax broke him, tearing away the last mask. The verdict thundered across the world. Sarah Williams said guilty. The word echoed like a death knell. The fallen star closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. Michael Harris said, the collapse is complete, empire reduced to dust. Flashbulbs erupted, capturing his fall frame by frame. Emily Clark whispered, this was not the end, but the beginning of his ruin. The gallery gasped, some wept, others cheered. Laura Johnson said, the champion has been erased, the criminal remains. Outside, chaos roared, fans crying and screaming at once. David Miller said, the verdict was not the end. It was only the beginning of her ruin. The climax ended with silence, heavier than screams. The empire lay in ruins, a silence heavier than applause filling the air. Sarah Williams said, the mansion once alive with celebrations now sits in emptiness. Dust settled on trophies, their shine dimmed by disgrace. Michael Harris said, glory becomes relic when legacy is poisoned. The fallen star wandered through empty halls, shadows his only companions. Emily Clark whispered, I watched him fade into silence, his voice no longer defiant. Friends who once fought for his attention vanished like ghosts. Laura Johnson said, his world shrank from arenas to cold, lifeless rooms. The emptiness became the loudest reminder of what was lost. David Miller said, the price of betrayal is not only prison but exile within one's own home. The resolution began with haunting isolation. The fans who once screamed his name turned silent. Sarah Williams said, the stadiums echo with absence, his legacy erased from chance. The fallen star stood at locked gates, hearing only the ghosts of roars. Michael Harris said, the silence mocks what once defined him. Graffiti scarred walls where his posters once shined. Emily Clark whispered, children who wore his name now refused to speak it. His identity, once larger than life, dissolved in whispers of betrayal. Laura Johnson said, he is no longer celebrated but remembered in caution. The silence of the masses was sharper than their screams. David Miller said, it is not hatred that destroys most deeply, but the emptiness of being forgotten. His downfall was complete. Isolation carved deeper wounds than the trial. Sarah Williams said, his voice rarely left his lips, only whispers echoing against walls. The fallen star sat with letters unopened, once filled with adoration, now hate. Michael Harris said, the world stopped listening. Shadows stretched long across the floor, his reflection blurred in cracked mirrors. Emily Clark whispered, his silence was not peace but torment. Nights became endless, sleep stolen by memories of roars turned boos. Laura Johnson said, this was the cost of empire, solitude in its ashes, food spoiled uneaten, phones rang unanswered. David Miller said, he was no longer the man on screens but a ghost in his own life. The resolution left him trapped in a prison without bars. The media still circled, refusing to let him vanish quietly. Sarah Williams said, "Every move he made in exile was documented. Paparazzi lenses peered into windows, chasing silence as if it were scandal." Michael Harris said, "They fed on the ghost of his fame." The fallen star pulled curtains shut, his face hidden in shadows. Emily Clark whispered, "He could never escape the hunger of those who consumed him." His exile was not freedom, but constant surveillance. Laura Johnson said, "The cameras that once celebrated him now stalked him with cruelty." Headlines twisted his loneliness into spectacle. David Miller said, "Infamy never sleeps, it follows like a curse." His attempt to disappear only made his absence louder. The story wound down not with redemption, but with ruin carved deep. Sarah Williams said, "The man who once embodied glory now embodies warning." The fallen star walked alone, shoulders hunched, his steps heavy. Michael Harris said, "He is remembered not for victories but for betrayals." Parks once filled with fans were empty, only whispers following him. Emily Clark whispered, "I saw him as broken, but still human." His existence became survival, stripped of pride. Laura Johnson said, "This is the resolution, not death, not freedom, but exile." Silence became his only companion. David Miller said, "In the ashes of his empire, the cost of fame lies bare." The resolution ended not with hope, but with haunting emptiness. The courthouse doors opened, and silence swallowed the chaos outside. Sarah Williams said, "He walked alone, no fans, no allies, only shadows trailing behind." The fallen star's eyes stayed on the ground, his face hollow. Michael Harris said, "The cameras captured not triumph but obliteration." Reporters shouted questions, but his lips never parted. Emily Clark whispered, "He was a man erased, leaving only a ghost." Every flash froze him into fragments of shame. Laura Johnson said, "The crowd, once roaring, stood stunned, unable to cheer or boo." His steps echoed against the cold pavement. David Miller said, "The end came not with screams but with silence that cuts deeper." The final act of downfall began in unbearable stillness. The media twisted silence into spectacle. Sarah Williams said, "He gave us nothing, and still we took everything." News screens replayed his walk endlessly, dissecting every step. Michael Harris said, "The absence of words became the loudest headline." Fans debated in living rooms, some still clinging to denial. Emily Clark whispered, "It was not just his trial, it was ours for believing so blindly." His legacy now lived only in debates of betrayal. Laura Johnson said, "The media fed not on fact but on obsession." The story consumed every screen, the fall never allowed to end. David Miller said, "This was not closure but obsession eternal." The world would never let him disappear quietly. His mansion, once a fortress, became a grave of memories. Sarah Williams said, "He vanished inside those walls, a prisoner of his own silence." Dust-coated frames of victories, curtains drawn tight. Michael Harris said, "Time turned triumph into rot." Emily Clark whispered, "I visited once, and it felt like stepping into a tomb." Shadows hung heavier than air, the smell of neglect lingering. Laura Johnson said, "His world no longer pulsed with fame but with decay. No laughter, no light, only echoes of footsteps." David Miller said, "This was the aftermath. Not redemption, not survival, but ruin carved deep." His downfall lived in every corner of empty rooms. The nation whispered his name only as warning. Sarah Williams said, "Parents told children his story not with pride, but as caution." The fallen star, once idolized, now haunted bedtime lessons. Michael Harris said, "Legends are remembered, but his became nightmare." Emily Clark whispered, "It was not hate I felt, but grief for what he became." Murals were painted over, his face erased from history. Laura Johnson said, "Society writes its own endings, and his is carved in shame." Crowds that once worshipped him now crossed the street at his shadow. David Miller said, The cost of glory is eternal damnation when betrayal defines legacy. The final blow spread beyond him, into culture itself, and then came the silence that never ended. Sarah Williams said, "In the end, he was not destroyed by his enemies." The fallen star walked down a dark street, alone, no cameras, no fans. Michael Harris said, "He was destroyed by himself." Emily Clark whispered, "I realized the tragedy was not the verdict but the man he had become." His figure vanished into night, swallowed by shadows. Laura Johnson said, "The world may forget details, but it will never forget this ending." No applause, no boos, only silence echoing like a heartbeat in the dark. David Miller said, "The story wasn't over, it was buried alive in memory." The final blow was not noise, but haunting quiet.